December 19, 1944. The bitter cold of the Ardennes forest cut through Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Stauffenberg's wool greatcoat as he studied the American prisoners being marched eastward. 3 days earlier, his commanders had laughed when they intercepted radio communications about General George Patton's audacious claim that he would turn his entire Third Army 90 degrees and relieve the besieged town of Bastogne within 48 hours. Amerikanische Prahlerei. They had called it American boasting and impossibility. The massive military redeployment Patton proposed would require weeks, not days. According to every principle of military logistics, the Wehrmacht had refined over 6 years of European warfare. Yet now, as von Stauffenberg watched the skies above, the snow-covered hills, something impossible was happening. American aircraft, dozens, then hundreds, were appearing on the horizon, dropping supplies to their surrounded comrades. What von Stauffenberg witnessed defied 5 years of carefully cultivated propaganda about American industrial weakness and military incompetence. The frozen forest around him had become the stage for one of history's most dramatic military pivots. While his own vaunted army, once the terror of Europe, was beginning to disintegrate in the snow, 100,000 German soldiers would soon be lost in this offensive that Hitler had promised would turn the tide of the war. Von Stauffenberg pulled out his field journal and began to write with trembling hands. "We have gravely underestimated what we face. What I am seeing cannot be explained by anything I have been told about our enemy." The German winter offensive of 1944, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, decadent consumers incapable of real sacrifice or military efficiency. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had carefully crafted an image of Americans as cowboys and gangsters, a mongrel nation without the discipline or will to challenge German military might. German officers and soldiers had been fed a steady diet of reassurance about American industrial capacity being dedicated to luxury items rather than weapons of war. "They build refrigerators while we build tanks," went one common refrain in German military circles of 1943. This perception was reinforced by carefully edited footage of American society shown in German newsreels, highlighting crime, racial tensions, and apparent material excess, while minimizing any evidence of industrial mobilization. By late 1944, however, the reality had become impossible to ignore for German commanders facing the American juggernaut in Europe. The true scale of American production had been systematically concealed from both German military leadership and the general population. Before the Battle of the Bulge, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of German forces in the West, had privately expressed doubts about the offensive to his staff, noting, "The Americans have a factory for everything." Yet, even he underestimated what Patton was about to demonstrate. German intelligence had calculated that redeploying an army the size of Patton's Third Army, with over 300,000 men, 14,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of supplies from the Saar region to the Ardennes would take between 2 and 3 weeks under optimal conditions. Their entire strategic plan for the Ardennes offensive relied on this logistical reality. The Germans had concentrated their remaining strength, 25 divisions, including their elite SS Panzer units, along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest. The region's narrow roads, thick forests, and hilly terrain were chosen specifically because they would minimize the Americans' material advantages and slow any reinforcement efforts. On December 16, 1944, the offensive began with initial success, creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines and surrounding the critical transportation hub of Bastogne. But what happened next would shatter years of German military certainty and expose the unbridgeable gulf between Axis propaganda and Allied industrial reality. Major Ernst Hoffmann had served in the Wehrmacht since 1936 and had fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts. As an officer in the 7th Army's Logistics Division, he had spent years calculating supply needs, transport capabilities, and movement timetables. When he heard Patton's intercepted radio message claiming a 48-hour redeployment timeline, he had joined his fellow officers in dismissive laughter. Even the Russians couldn't move that quickly, and they don't care about losing half their men in the process, he had remarked to his commanding officer, General Hans Krebs. On December 19th, however, Hoffmann was stationed at an observation post near St. Vith when the first evidence of the impossible began to materialize. American P-47 Thunderbolts appeared in the skies despite poor weather conditions, followed by C-47 transport planes dropping supplies to the surrounded troops. By December 20th, the distant thunder of Patton's artillery could be heard approaching from the south. Hoffmann's military education had not prepared him for this. The America he had been taught about, inefficient, disorganized, and soft, seemed to bear no resemblance to the military machine now bearing down on the German positions. Hoffmann began keeping detailed notes of what he observed, writing, "The speed of their redeployment defies all military logic. Our entire offensive planning was based on the assumption that such a movement would take weeks. Patton has done it in days. This represents not just a tactical failure on our part, but a fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities." The reality that confronted German military leadership during those critical days of December 1944 was the culmination of the most extraordinary industrial mobilization in human history. What German intelligence had failed to fully comprehend was the scale and speed of America's conversion to war production. In 1941, the United States had produced approximately 4,500 aircraft for military use. By 1944, American factories were producing over 8,000 aircraft per month, more than Germany could produce in an entire year. While German propaganda focused on American cars and refrigerators, the Ford Motor Company had transformed its massive River Rouge plant to produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The Willow Run factory alone produced more aircraft than the entire Italian aircraft industry. This industrial miracle extended to every category of war materiel. American factories were producing a new merchant ship every 17 hours, tank. Production had risen from 4,000 in 1942 to 29,000 in 1944. When it came to motor transport, the very backbone of Patton's extraordinary redeployment, the numbers were even more staggering. By 1944, the United States was producing over 240,000 military trucks annually, while Germany struggled to produce 30,000. This disparity would prove decisive in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. Oberleutnant Werner Thoma, a veteran tank commander with the 2nd Panzer Division, had been fighting the Americans since Normandy. His experience had taught him to respect American artillery and air power, but he remained confident in German tactical superiority. "They waste so much," he often told his crew, 10 shells where we would use 1, 20 gallons of fuel where we would use 5. This perceived wastefulness, interpreted by German officers as inefficiency, was actually the most visible evidence of America's overwhelming abundance. On December 21st, Thoma's Panther tank was disabled near the village of Foy after running out of fuel. As he and his crew prepared to destroy their vehicle and retreat on foot, they were captured by elements of the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's rapidly advancing 3rd Army. What Thoma witnessed next challenged everything he had been told about the American military. The American unit that captured them had more tanks in a single company than Thoma's entire battalion had operational. Each American Sherman tank carried a full load of ammunition and extra fuel cans. As a prisoner, Thoma was transported to the rear in a half-track vehicle that appeared brand new. Along the road he counted dozens of supply trucks moving forward, carrying ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies. It was like watching an endless conveyor belt, he later wrote in a letter from captivity. We had been fighting with carefully counted shells and measuring our fuel by the liter, while they operated as if supply constraints didn't exist. At one point, Thoma observed American soldiers discarding partially used ration packs to make room for fresh ones, a scene so shocking to a German officer accustomed to strict resource conservation that he recorded it as almost obscene in its casualness. The journey of German prisoners like Thoma from the front lines to POW camps in America would provide further revelations. Colonel Wilhelm Herberg of the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division was captured on December 23rd near Bastogne. His journey took him from Belgium to England, then by troopship to Boston, and finally by train to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. Each stage peeled away another layer of propaganda-induced misconception. The troopship that transported him across the Atlantic was one of hundreds produced by American shipyards since 1942. The train that carried him into the American heartland was part of a rail network that dwarfed Germany's in both size and capacity. But it was the American landscape itself that most profoundly affected officers like Herberg. Mile after mile of factories, farms, cities untouched by war, he wrote in his diary. No bombed buildings, no destroyed bridges, no fields torn by artillery, and everywhere signs of production, new automobiles, despite the war, construction projects continuing, as if peace had already been declared. Herberg had come from a Germany where every resource was dedicated to the war effort, where civilians used ration cards for the most basic necessities, and where Allied bombing had reduced many cities to rubble. The contrast could not have been more stark or more demoralizing. At Camp Shelby, Herberg and his fellow officers were housed in heated barracks, given new clothing, and fed a diet that exceeded what many German civilians could obtain. The daily ration for German POWs in American camps included meat, eggs, butter, fruit, and even coffee and sugar, luxury items that had long disappeared from German civilian life. This abundance of food became one of the most psychologically devastating revelations for German prisoners. Men who had been told they were fighting to protect their homeland from deprivation found themselves better fed in captivity than their own families were in Germany. As Patton's Third Army continued its remarkable advance toward Bastogne, the evidence of American industrial superiority manifested not just in the quantity of equipment, but in the seemingly endless variety of specialized vehicles and weapons. Major Karl-Heinz Prinz, an artillery officer with the 9th Panzer Division, watched in disbelief as American forces advanced through a heavy snowstorm on December 22nd. They had vehicles we had never seen before, he later reported, during interrogation. Special snow-clearing equipment, bridge-laying vehicles, recovery trucks that could pull tanks out of mud or snow. The Americans had deployed bulldozers modified with snow plows to clear paths through snowdrifts. They had endless supplies of winter clothing, including specialized rubber-soled boots that prevented slipping on ice. Meanwhile, many German soldiers were fighting with summer uniforms supplemented by whatever they could scavenge. Some German infantry units reported that up to 20% of their casualties during the Ardennes offensive were from frostbite rather than enemy action. The American ability to fight and supply their forces in winter conditions revealed yet another dimension of industrial capacity that German intelligence had failed to appreciate. It wasn't just that Americans could produce more. They could produce specialized equipment for every conceivable military need or environmental challenge. Lieutenant Hans Wehler was a communications officer with the 6th SS Panzer Army when he was captured on December 26th. His specialized training made him particularly attentive to the Americans' communications equipment. Every American OR squad leader had a radio, he noted with astonishment. Every vehicle, every platoon, all in constant communication. In the Wehrmacht, radios were precious commodities, generally available only at the company level or above. The Americans, by contrast, had achieved a level of communications saturation that allowed for unprecedented coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. This communications advantage translated directly into tactical flexibility. While German units often had to rely on pre-planned operations with limited ability to adapt to changing circumstances, American forces could redirect artillery fire, call in air support, or coordinate with neighboring units in real time. This capability was a direct product of American industrial capacity. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 1,500,000 military radio sets, more than Germany had produced throughout the entire war. Companies that had previously manufactured civilian radios, telephones, and other electronics had converted completely to military production, bringing their expertise in mass production to bear on the war effort. The sky above the Ardennes provided perhaps the most visible evidence of the disparity between German expectations and American reality. Despite December weather that German meteorologists had predicted would ground Allied air forces, American aircraft appeared whenever there was even marginal flying weather. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and A-20 Havoc attack aircraft struck German columns with seeming disregard for ammunition conservation. Captain Friedrich Merz, an anti-aircraft officer with the 5th Panzer Army, described American air attacks as industrial in their intensity. In one engagement near Houffalize on December 23rd, Merz counted more than 60 fighter-bombers, attacking a single German column over the course of 3 hours. They would appear, drop their bombs, fire their rockets, strafe with their machine guns, then disappear only to be replaced immediately by another group, he wrote. There was no pause, no conservation of effort. It was as if they had unlimited aircraft and unlimited ammunition. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was almost entirely absent from the skies over the Ardennes. What few German aircraft could be mustered for the offensive were hoarded for a single massive air operation on January 1st, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte, which, despite achieving tactical surprise, ultimately cost the Luftwaffe nearly 300 aircraft it could not replace. American aircraft losses, meanwhile, were typically replaced within days. The culmination of Patton's impossible achievement came on December 26, 1944, when elements of his 4th Armored Division broke through to the surrounded forces at Bastogne. The Americans defending Bastogne, primarily. The 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded since December 20th. When German forces demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. This defiance, incomprehensible to the German officers who received it, was not mere bravado. It reflected a confidence born of material reality. Though surrounded, the American forces in Bastogne had received over 150 tons of supplies by air during the siege. When Patton's forces arrived, they did not find starving, ammunition-depleted defenders, but a garrison that had maintained combat effectiveness despite their isolation. The relief of Bastogne represented not just a tactical victory, but a triumph of an entire industrial system, from the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh to the supply depots of England and France to the snow-covered roads of Belgium. What the German High Command had declared logistically impossible had been accomplished through a combination of leadership, determination, and overwhelming material superiority. The cost to the German military was catastrophic. By mid-January 1945, when the Battle of the Bulge officially ended, the Wehrmacht had lost approximately 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. More than 800 tanks and assault guns, the heart of Germany's remaining offensive capability in the West, had been destroyed or abandoned. Perhaps most significantly, The Luftwaffe had expended its last operational reserve in a failed attempt to support the offensive. These losses could not be replaced. German industry, under relentless Allied bombing, could not produce enough fuel, vehicles, or ammunition to sustain operations on either front. The human losses were equally irreplaceable. Many of the units destroyed in the Ardennes offensive had contained Germany's last reserves of experienced soldiers. Formations like the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich would never again achieve their former combat power. In contrast, American losses, while significant at approximately 19,000 casualties, were quickly replaced. By February 1945, all American divisions that had participated in the Battle of the Bulge were back at full strength. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. For many German officers and soldiers, the Ardennes offensive represented the moment when the true scale of American industrial might become undeniable. Major Wilhelm Strasse, an intelligence officer with Army Group B, compiled a report in January 1945 that starkly outlined the production disparities between Germany and the United States. The enemy can replace everything: men, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, within weeks, he wrote. We have lost the ability to replace anything in meaningful quantities. This is no longer a military contest, but an industrial one, and on those terms, defeat is mathematically certain. His report included calculations showing that American factories were producing more military trucks each month than Germany had produced in the entire year of 1944. Similar disparities existed across all categories of war materiel. American artillery units were firing more ammunition in a single day than German factories could produce in a month. American refineries were producing more aviation fuel each week than the entire German synthetic fuel industry could generate in a year. These were not matters of tactical approach or fighting spirit, but of raw industrial capacity, and they pointed to an inescapable conclusion. Germany could not win. A war of attrition against the United States. For prisoners of war like Oberst Colonel Heinrich Müller, captured near St. Vith on December 23rd, the journey into American captivity became a journey into an industrial reality that Nazi propaganda had systematically concealed. Müller's transport to the United States took him through England, where he observed massive supply depots stretching to the horizon. Endless rows of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, all new, all waiting to be shipped to the continent, he wrote in a journal he kept throughout his captivity. I estimated enough material to equip 20 divisions, and this was just one depot, of many. When Müller arrived at Camp Cook in California in February 1945, he was struck by what he called the casual abundance of American military life. The camp, built to house American troops before being converted to a POW facility, featured amenities that would have been considered luxurious in many parts of Germany even before the war. Hot water, abundant electricity, and 3 substantial meals daily were provided not as special privileges, but as standard accommodations. Most revealing to Müller was the attitude of his American guards toward supplies and equipment. Nothing is repaired that can be replaced, he observed. A truck with engine problems is not laboriously fixed, as it would be in the Wehrmacht. It is simply taken out of service and a new one brought in. Worn boots are discarded rather than rizzled. Bent rifle barrels are not straightened but exchanged for new weapons. This approach to materiel, seen by some German officers as wasteful, was in fact the signature of an economy of abundance, a system that could afford to optimize for time rather than resource conservation. What Müller and his fellow officers witnessed in America was the fruit of an industrial transformation that had begun even before the United States formally entered the war. President Franklin Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech in December 1940 had signaled American intention to convert civilian industry to military production on an unprecedented scale. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, this conversion was complete and operating at peak efficiency. American automobile factories had entirely ceased civilian vehicle production, turning out jeeps, trucks, tanks, and aircraft instead. The Chrysler Corporation had constructed a massive new tank arsenal in Detroit that could produce a 30-ton Sherman tank every 30 minutes. Steel mills in Pittsburgh and Gary were operating 24 hours a day, producing more steel than all the Axis powers combined. Shipyards in places like Mobile, Alabama, and Portland, Oregon, were launching Liberty ships and aircraft carriers at a pace that German naval architects had declared theoretically impossible. Even consumer goods companies had been integrated into the war production system. Cosmetics factories produced ammunition. Toy manufacturers made military optics. And food processors packed combat rations. The result was a flood of war material that simply overwhelmed German capacity to respond. The abundance extended to the most basic elements of military supply. Captain Otto Brauer, a quartermaster officer with the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division, had spent the war carefully allocating increasingly scarce resources. Captured during the fighting around Bastogne, he was transported to Camp Gruber in Oklahoma. There, he was assigned to work in the camp's supply section, giving him direct visibility into American logistical practices. "The quantity of material is not the most shocking aspect," he wrote to a fellow officer in the camp. "It is the complete absence of shortages in any category. They have everything in excess: food, ammunition, vehicles, fuel, clothing, medical supplies. There are no substitutes, no ersatz products, no improvised solutions. When the Americans need something, they simply provide it in its proper form and in quantities that exceed requirements." Brauer noted that American supply officers routinely ordered 20% more of everything than their calculated needs, a buffer that would have been unimaginable in the resource-constrained Wehrmacht. He was particularly struck by the contrast in food supplies. "The average American soldier receives more protein in one day than a German soldier was allocated for a week on the Eastern Front," he observed. "Their standard combat ration contains more calories than what our frontline troops considered a feast." For men like Oberstleutnant Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Weitzel, who had served in the Wehrmacht since 1936, the evidence of American industrial superiority raised profound questions about the foundations of Nazi ideology. Weitzel had been told repeatedly that the decadent democracies lacked the will and discipline to match Germany's war effort. America, with its diverse population and capitalist system, was supposed to be particularly vulnerable to the stresses of total war. Yet what Weitzel observed first as a combatant in the Ardennes and later as a prisoner at Fort Benning, Georgia, was precisely the opposite. The American system, which we were told was chaotic and inefficient, has produced a war machine of unimaginable power, he wrote in a letter that was later confiscated by camp censors. Their diversity, which was supposed to be a weakness, has given them strength. Their factories operate with workers of every background, women, men of different races and nationalities, all contributing to a production miracle. Weitzel, like many educated German officers, began to recognize that he had been fighting not just against superior numbers, but against a superior system of production and organization. This realization was particularly bitter for those who had fully embraced Nazi racial theories. The evidence before their eyes of African American soldiers equipped with better weapons than the Wehrmacht could provide, of American women working in factories producing more tanks than German men, directly contradicted the ideological foundations of National Socialism. The industrial disparity revealed during the Battle of the Bulge extended beyond military equipment to include the realm of medicine and casualty care. Dr. Ernst Weber, a surgeon with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, was captured after his field hospital was overrun on December 27th. What he witnessed in American military medicine shattered his professional pride. "Their mobile surgical units have equipment we could only dream of," he recorded in his medical diary. "Blood plasma in unlimited quantities, penicillin for every wounded man, X-ray machines that can be set up in 20 minutes." The American approach to battlefield medicine emphasized rapid evacuation and early treatment, a system made possible by their abundant transport aircraft and motor vehicles. German wounded in the Ardennes often waited days for evacuation, using horse-drawn carts on snow-covered roads. American casualties were typically reaching field hospitals within hours of injury, often transported by specially designed ambulance vehicles or even light aircraft. Dr. Weber noted that American surgeons routinely performed procedures that German medical units had abandoned due to resource constraints. "They use new surgical gloves for each operation," he wrote with astonishment. "We have been washing and reusing ours until they fall apart." When Weber himself developed pneumonia in February 1945, he received a course of penicillin, a medicine so scarce in Germany that it was reserved for the highest-ranking officers and Nazi Party officials. "I received better medical care as a prisoner than I could provide to my own men as their doctor," he concluded. The overwhelming evidence of American industrial superiority had profound effects on German prisoners' morale and worldview. Major General Rudolf Kastner, an artillery officer captured near Houffalize, described the psychological process in his post-war memoirs. "First came disbelief. Surely what we were seeing was exceptional, a showcase meant to impress us. Then came rationalization. Perhaps this abundance was why the Americans were failing elsewhere, having concentrated everything in one place. Finally came acceptance, as we saw that this was simply the standard American way of war everywhere. For many prisoners, this acceptance led to a complete re-evaluation of everything they had been told about the war and Germany's place in it. The process was particularly wrenching for those who had fully committed to Nazi ideology. Captain Heinz Schultz, a company commander in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and a dedicated Nazi Party member, underwent a profound transformation during his captivity at Camp Carson, Colorado. His letters, monitored by camp intelligence officers, showed a man grappling with the collapse of his belief system. "If they could build all this while fighting a two-front war," he wrote to his wife in April 1945, "imagine what they could have built in peace. We never had a chance, not because our soldiers lacked courage or our engineers lacked skill, but because we were fighting against something far bigger than we understood." The Battle of the Bulge marked not just a military turning point, but the moment when many German military professionals were forced to confront the bankruptcy of their leadership's strategic vision. Hitler had launched the offensive with the Moe, belief that the Western Allies were overextended and that a decisive blow might cause the alliance to fracture. The ability of the Americans to absorb the attack, rapidly redeploy forces, and counterattack with overwhelming material superiority demonstrated the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of German strategy. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, a staff officer with the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "The Ardennes showed us the full extent of our strategic failure. We had built a military designed to win quick victories through superior tactics and operational art. But we were fighting an industrial war where production capacity ultimately mattered more than tactical brilliance. The Americans could replace. Their losses we could not. They could afford mistakes. We could not. This was not a war of armies, but of economies, and on those terms we had already lost by 1942. Von Mellenthin's analysis reflected a growing recognition among German military professionals that the Third Reich's leadership had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. Tactical victories, no matter how brilliant, could not overcome strategic industrial inferiority. Perhaps the most poignant testimonies came from German officers who witnessed the contrast between American abundance and German civilian suffering. Colonel Werner von Haeften was captured in the early days of the offensive and eventually interned at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. As a prisoner, he received letters from his family in Dresden describing increasing hardship, food shortages, lack of heating fuel, and the constant threat of Allied bombing. "Today I had eggs, bacon, white bread, and coffee for breakfast," he wrote back in March 1945. "I am gaining weight while you are hungry. I am warm while you are cold. I am safe while you face bombing. There is something deeply wrong with a war that leaves the captured better off than the civilians." At home, for many prisoners, this inversion of normal expectations, where captivity brought improved living conditions, was the final proof of Germany's strategic defeat. Hauptmann, Captain Karl Weidenfeld, writing from Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky, expressed a similar sentiment. "We are defeated not by the enemy's weapons, but by their wealth. They can afford to treat prisoners better than we can afford to treat our own families. What does this say about the war we have been fighting?" As the European conflict entered its final months in early 1945, many German POWs in America began to look toward the post-war future. Their direct experience of American industrial capacity shaped their expectations and plans. Major Edgar Stelzer, held at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, wrote extensively about what he had learned during his captivity. "Germany must understand that my future lies in cooperation, not conflict, with the American system," he argued, in discussions with fellow officers. "We have seen with our own eyes what their industry can accomplish when directed toward war. Imagine what might be possible if we could access this productive power for peaceful reconstruction." Stelzer was not alone in this thinking. Many German officers, particularly those with technical or engineering backgrounds, began to see American methods of mass production and standardization as models for Germany's eventual rebuilding. Some even began studying American industrial techniques, business practices, and organizational methods while still in captivity. Captain Ludwig Erhard, an economist before the war who would later play a key role in West Germany's economic miracle as Minister of Economics, used his time as a POW to study American manufacturing systems. "We have been defeated by a superior economic model as much as by superior forces," he wrote. "Our future depends on understanding and adapting this model rather than resisting it." The legacy of this industrial revelation would shape post-war Germany profoundly. Many of the German officers and soldiers who experienced American abundance firsthand would return to play significant roles in rebuilding their country. Their direct knowledge of American capabilities helped dispel lingering myths about the war and accelerated Germany's reorientation toward the West. Hans Speidel, who served as a general during the war and witnessed the American counterattack in the Ardennes, later became one of the architects of West Germany's integration into NATO. In his memoirs, he cited his wartime experience as formative. Those of us who saw the true scale of American power understood that Germany's future security depended on partnership with this industrial giant, not competition against it. Similar perspectives influenced Germany's economic reconstruction. The emphasis on export-oriented manufacturing, standardization, and mass production that characterized West Germany's economic policy in the 1950s bore the clear influence of lessons learned from American industry during the war. The adoption of the Marshall Plan and the eager embrace of American investment and technology transfer were facilitated by German elites who had directly experienced the productivity gap during the war years. For the United States, the Battle of the Bulge represented a moment when the full potential of American industrial mobilization was demonstrated on the battlefield. The rapid redeployment of Patton's Third Army moving 14 divisions 90 degrees across the front in winter. Conditions in less than a week showcased not just military leadership, but the logistical backbone that made such movement possible. The hundreds of thousands of trucks, the millions of gallons of fuel, the seemingly unlimited ammunition supplies, all products of factories thousands of miles away, proved decisive in a way that tactical brilliance alone could not match. In the decades after the war, American military planners would continue to emphasize this industrial approach to warfare, building forces designed to overwhelm adversaries with material superiority rather than seeking tactical advantages. The doctrine of overwhelming force that would characterize American military operations from Korea to the Persian Gulf had its roots in the success of industrial warfare, as demonstrated in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes in December's 1944. The human dimension of this industrial disparity extended beyond the battlefield. German prisoners who returned to Europe after the war brought with them first-hand accounts of American abundance that contradicted both Nazi-era propaganda and post-war Soviet narratives. Major Heinrich Ostertag, repatriated to Germany in 1947 after 2 years in American captivity, became an influential voice in his community in Bavaria. "I tell people what I saw with my own eyes," he would say when challenged. About his pro-American views, "I saw factories that produced in a day what our best plants needed a month to make. I saw a society where ordinary workers owned automobiles and had meat on their tables daily. I saw a military that could afford to waste more than we could afford to use carefully." These are not political opinions, but observed facts. Such testimonies, multiplied across thousands of returning prisoners, helped create the cultural and political conditions for West Germany's integration into the Western economic and security system. The direct experience of American industrial capacity served as a powerful inoculation against both neo-Nazi revisionism and communist propaganda during the early Cold War years. December 19, 1944. As Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Stauffenberg watched American aircraft fill the skies above the Ardennes forest, he could not have known that he was witnessing not just a military turning point, but a moment of historical revelation. The offensive that Hitler had launched with such high hopes 3 days earlier would ultimately accelerate Germany's defeat rather than delay it. The 100,000 German soldiers lost in the snow would never be replaced. The fuel consumed by German tanks in their brief advance represented the last significant mobile reserves available to the Wehrmacht. But beyond these immediate military consequences lay a deeper truth that von Stauffenberg and his fellow officers were just beginning to grasp. They had been fighting not just against another army, but against the full productive capacity of the world's greatest industrial power, a force that no amount of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit could overcome. In the snow-covered hills of the Ardennes, the mathematical certainty of defeat was written not just in blood, but in steel, rubber, aluminum, and oil. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and 100 other American cities had rendered their ultimate verdict, and no appeal was possible. The Battle of the Bulge revealed the unbridgeable gap between propaganda and reality, between the Germany that might have been and the America that actually was. It was a lesson written in the snow, paid for with 100,000 lives, and destined to reshape the post-war world in ways that would have been unimaginable to those who had mocked Patton's 48-hour promise just days before.